The desert heat rippled across the horizon as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his command tent outside El Alamein, staring at a decoded British transmission. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of understanding. Everything he had believed about his tactical genius, every victory he had celebrated, every near-miraculous escape was built on a foundation of lies. The British hadn't been lucky. They had been listening. If you want to know how one man's devastating realization changed the entire course of World War II, stay with this story until the very end. Because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Desert Fox. It was September 1942, and Rommel's Afrika Korps had pushed deeper into Egypt than anyone thought possible. The newspapers back in Berlin called him a god of war. Hitler himself had sent telegrams of congratulation, but in the suffocating heat of his tent, Rommel was piecing together a truth that turned his stomach. The American military attaché in Cairo, Colonel Boniface, had been sending detailed intelligence reports about British positions, strength assessments, and strategic plans directly to Washington using what everyone believed was an unbreakable code. For months, Rommel's Signals Intelligence Unit had been intercepting every single transmission. Fellas had no idea he was compromised. Neither did the Americans. But the Germans knew, and they had been using that knowledge like a scalpel, cutting through British defenses with surgical precision. Rommel's seemingly supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements hadn't been genius at all. It had been espionage. The irony was suffocating. While Rommel devoured American intelligence about the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were simultaneously reading German Enigma transmissions. The entire North African campaign had become a bizarre chess match where both players could see each other's pieces, but neither realized their own hand was exposed. Rommel understood strategy, logistics, and the psychology of warfare, but he had never questioned why his intelligence seemed almost too good to be true. Captain Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, Rommel's intelligence chief, had been the one to break the news. Not about the American attaché. Rommel had known about that source for months, but about something far worse. The British had changed their codes, abruptly, completely, and they had done it right after neutralizing the 621st Signals Battalion, Rommel's mobile monitoring unit, commanded by Captain Alfred Seebohm. During the Battle of Gazala in June, Seebohm had been killed in the attack. His entire unit was destroyed, and with it went the Wehrmacht's ability to eavesdrop on British battlefield communications. At the time, Rommel had cursed the loss, but moved forward. Now, standing in his tent with fragments of intelligence reports spread across his planning table, he understood. The British hadn't just gotten lucky. They had known exactly where Seebohm's unit was positioned. They had targeted it deliberately, and they could only have known its location if they were reading German communications. The realization came in waves. First, disbelief. Then, anger. Finally, a cold, calculating terror. If the British had been reading German signals, they knew his supply situation. They knew how desperately short he was on fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. They knew about the delays in Mediterranean convoys. They knew that despite his fearsome reputation, the Afrika Korps was operating on fumes and willpower. Rommel walked outside, letting the desert wind hit his face. Around him, German and Italian soldiers prepared defensive positions, dug foxholes, and serviced vehicles that were barely functional. They believed in him. They thought their commander possessed some mystical understanding of warfare that made victory inevitable. What would they think if they knew the truth. That their seemingly invincible leader had been fed intelligence from a compromised American source, while simultaneously having every one of his own strategic communications decoded by the enemy. He thought back to the Battle of Alam Halfa at the end of August, just weeks earlier. He had launched what should have been a devastating offensive through the southern flank of British lines. The plan was textbook Rommel: fast, aggressive, unexpected. Except it hadn't been unexpected at all. British General Bernard Montgomery had fortified Alam Halfa Ridge with the 44th Division and positioned armor exactly where it needed to be. The attack had failed catastrophically. At the time, Rommel attributed it to bad luck and dwindling supplies. Now he understood. Montgomery had read the German battle plans before the first tank had even moved. The war in North Africa had always been a logistical nightmare for the Axis. Supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, constantly harassed by British aircraft and naval forces operating from Malta. Rommel's previous successes, his lightning advances across Libya and into Egypt, had been possible because of two things: tactical brilliance and actionable intelligence. Take away the intelligence advantage, and suddenly the logistical reality became impossible to ignore. Von Mellenthin appeared at Rommel's side, his face drawn and exhausted. The intelligence officer had aged 10 years in the past few months. He knew what Rommel knew, and the weight of it was crushing. The two men stood in silence, watching the sun dip toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and blood. "How long?" Rommel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Unknown, Herr Feldmarschall," von Mellenthin replied. "Could be months. Could be from the beginning." From the beginning? Rommel let that possibility settle in his mind. Every victory, every tactical masterpiece, every moment of glory, potentially compromised by enemy codebreakers who saw through his every move. He had written extensively about warfare, published infantry attacks before the war, and lectured on the importance of surprise and maneuver. Now he was the one being surprised, outmaneuvered by an enemy who could read his thoughts before he even transmitted them. The Americans had finally changed. Feller's Code in late June. Around the same time Seebohm's unit was destroyed, Rommel's twin sources of intelligence had evaporated almost simultaneously. Since then, every offensive had stalled. Every calculated risk had backfired. The British seemed to know exactly where he was weak and precisely when to strike. Montgomery, his counterpart across the minefields, was no tactical genius. Rommel knew that. Montgomery was methodical, cautious, and predictable. But Montgomery had something more valuable than brilliance. He had certainty. While Rommel guessed and gambled, Montgomery knew. The British general could see German strength returns, supply manifests, and operational orders as clearly as if they were typed on his own letterhead. A messenger arrived with another situation report. Fuel reserves were at 11%. Ammunition for the 88mm anti-aircraft guns, the most effective weapons against British armor, was rationed to 3 rounds per gun per day. The Italian divisions, which made up nearly half of Panzer Army Africa, were barely combat effective. Morale was cracking under the relentless heat and the growing understanding that they were trapped between the Mediterranean and an enemy that somehow always seemed one step ahead. Rommel dismissed the messenger and returned to his tent. Inside, he kept a photograph of his wife Lucy and their son Manfred. He had written to them religiously, describing his victories, his confidence in ultimate triumph, his certainty that he was making history. What would he write now? that he had been played for a fool, that the great desert fox had spent months chasing his own tail while British intelligence officers in England laughed at his every move. He couldn't say that. Not to his family. Not to his soldiers. Not even to himself, really, because accepting it fully would mean accepting that he had failed at the most fundamental aspect of military leadership, protecting his communications. The Germans had invested everything in Enigma, the supposedly unbreakable encryption machine. Officers across every theater trusted it with their lives. If that trust was misplaced, if the British had indeed cracked Enigma, then the entire Wehrmacht was fighting blind. Rommel poured himself a glass of water from a nearly empty canteen and sat down at his planning table. Maps covered every surface: defensive positions, minefields, supply routes, potential fallback lines. He studied them with fresh eyes, trying to think like Montgomery, trying to anticipate how the British would exploit their intelligence. Advantage that minefield between the two armies was extensive, laid over weeks of preparation. The British called it the Devil's Garden. Rommel's engineers had embedded thousands of mines across the desert, creating a barrier that would force any British offensive into predictable channels where German anti-tank guns and artillery could devastate them. Or at least, that was the theory. If the British knew the minefield patterns, if they had decoded the German engineering reports, they could map safe corridors through the Devil's Garden and punch through exactly where Rommel was weakest. He needed to change everything, not just tactics or positioning, but the entire operational framework. He needed to assume that every transmission was compromised, that every order was being read by enemy analysts, that every strength report was giving Montgomery a precise picture of Axis capabilities. Fighting under that assumption meant reverting to tactics from an earlier era: written orders delivered by courier, radio silence except for emergencies, deception operations to feed false information into channels he knew were compromised. But there was no time. Montgomery was preparing a major offensive, that much was obvious. British forces had been building up for weeks, stockpiling supplies, bringing in fresh divisions from across the empire. The offensive would come soon, and when it did, Rommel's depleted, exhausted, intelligence-blind army would have to face it without the advantages that had made them formidable. Von Mellenthin returned after dark, bringing with him another officer, Major Otto, a signals specialist who had been investigating communication security. Otto looked even worse than von Mellenthin, his uniform stained with sweat and dust, his hands shaking as he saluted. "Tell him," von Mellenthin said quietly. Otto took a breath. "Herr Feldmarschall, we have confirmed that several Enigma settings were compromised during the Gazala offensive. Captain Seebohm's unit carried current coding materials. When his position was overrun, those materials would have been captured by British forces." Rommel nodded slowly. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to have confirmation. The British hadn't just broken Enigma through mathematical brilliance, though they likely had. They also had physical examples, captured machines, and codebooks that made the codebreakers work infinitely easier. "How long have they been reading us?" Rommel asked. "We believe since early 1941, Herr Feld. Perhaps earlier." The rooms seemed to tilt. Early 1941. That was before Rommel had even arrived in North Africa. Every operation, every victory, every celebrated tactical triumph had been conducted while the enemy read his mail. His push to the Egyptian border, his defeat of Operation Battleaxe, his recapture of Benghazi, all of it conducted under the watchful eye of British intelligence. And yet, he had still won battles. Even with the British reading his communications, even with Montgomery knowing his plans, the Afrika Korps had achieved the impossible. That meant something. It meant his soldiers were better trained, more aggressive, more willing to take risks. It meant German tactical doctrine, the combined arms approach of tanks, infantry, and artillery working in concert, was superior to British methods. It meant that even when fighting with one hand tied behind his back, the Wehrmacht could compete with an enemy that had every possible advantage. But competing wasn't enough. Not anymore. The strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. German forces in Russia were locked in a death struggle at The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies over North Africa, was increasingly absent, pulled back to defend the Reich or support the Eastern Front. Italian convoys carrying fuel and ammunition were being sunk with alarming regularity, victims of British submarines and aircraft that somehow always knew exactly when and where the ships would be. Rommel had begged the High Command for reinforcements, for supplies, for any support that might allow him to resume offensive operations. Hitler's response had been characteristically delusional. Hold the line. Victory was inevitable. The will of the Führer would prevail. Rommel had learned to ignore the propaganda, but he couldn't ignore the mathematics. His army was dying by inches, starved of fuel, ammunition, and hope. The only advantage he had left was defensive positioning. The El Alamein line was a natural fortress, bounded by the Mediterranean to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south. Montgomery would have to attack through the Devil's Garden, into prepared German positions against an enemy that excelled at defensive warfare. Even knowing Rommel's dispositions, even with complete intelligence, the British would pay a horrific price for every kilometre gained, unless the thought crept into Rommel's mind like a serpent, unless Montgomery knew not just where German forces were positioned, but exactly how weak they were. If the British understood that the 88mm guns had only a handful of shells, that the panzer divisions were down to a fraction of their authorized strength, that Italian units would collapse under pressure, then Montgomery could concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point and shatter the entire line. That was the nightmare scenario. Not a grinding, attritional battle that might be survivable, but a decisive breakthrough that would destroy Panzer Army Africa and leave Egypt, and potentially the entire Middle East, open to Allied conquest. Rommel stood and walked to the map table, studying the defensive positions with Otto and von Mellenthin flanking him. He pointed to the northern sector near the coast. Here, this is where Montgomery will hit us. Maximum concentration, straight through our strongest defenses, exactly where we expect him. He knows we expect it, so he'll commit everything to that point, overwhelm us with material superiority, and break through before we can reposition reserves. Von Mellenthin frowned. That would be costly for them. Thousands of casualties. Montgomery has thousands of men to spare, Rommel replied. We don't. He can afford a frontal assault. We can't afford to defend against one, not with our current strength. Otto cleared his throat. Permission to speak freely, Herr Rommel nodded. Why doesn't High Command withdraw us to a more defensible position? Fall back to Libya, shorten our supply lines, rebuild our strength. El Alamein is a trap. We're pinned here with the sea at our backs. It was a good question, the kind of question a rational military organization would ask. But the Third Reich was not rational, and Hitler was not a strategist. Retreating was weakness. Weakness was unacceptable. Therefore, retreat was impossible. The logic was circular and absolute. Because the Führer has ordered us to hold, Rommel said simply. And we will hold. Until we can't. The desert night was cold, a shocking contrast to the daytime heat. Rommel walked the perimeter of his headquarters compound, reviewing defensive preparations, speaking with soldiers, maintaining the appearance of confidence and control. The men needed to see their commander unbowed, certain of victory. They couldn't know that he was operating blind, that every decision was now a guess, that the intelligence advantage he had relied upon had evaporated like morning dew. He thought about Montgomery, sitting in his command post, reading decrypted German signals, knowing exactly how desperate the situation had become. The British general was probably savoring this. Montgomery was a vain, arrogant man who craved recognition and glory. Defeating Rommel, the celebrated desert fox, would make his career immortal. And he would do it not through tactical brilliance, but through overwhelming material superiority and perfect intelligence. There was a bitter justice in it. Rommel had built his reputation partly on surprise and deception, on hitting the enemy where they were weak, on exploiting opportunities that other commanders would miss. Now he was on the receiving end, facing an opponent who could see his every weakness, who knew exactly when and where to strike. A week passed. Then too, the tension in Panzer Army Africa grew unbearable. Everyone knew the British offensive was coming. Reconnaissance reported massive supply build-ups, fresh tank regiments arriving from Britain, new artillery pieces being positioned along the entire front. The RAF flew constant sorties, bombing supply dumps, strafing vehicle columns, maintaining complete air superiority. German fighters tried to contest the skies but were hopelessly outnumbered. Rommel fell ill, as he often did under stress. His stomach, never strong, rebelled against the combination of anxiety, heat, and poor food. His doctor recommended evacuation to Germany for treatment, but Rommel refused. He couldn't leave his men, not now, not when everything he had built was about to be tested in fire. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, the world exploded. Montgomery launched Operation Lightfoot, the second Battle of El Alamein, with an artillery barrage that shook the desert like an earthquake. Over 1,000 guns fired simultaneously, raining shells on German positions with such intensity that the ground itself seemed to liquefy. Rommel, lying in his tent fighting another bout of illness, struggled to his feet as the barrage continued, minute after minute, hour after hour. This was it. The decisive battle. Everything else had been prelude. British infantry advanced behind the artillery, sappers clearing paths through the minefields, tanks moving up in massive formations. Rommel rushed to his forward command post, ignoring his doctor's protests, knowing that his presence on the battlefield was the only thing keeping German morale from collapsing entirely. The attack came exactly where he had predicted, the northern sector. Montgomery had indeed chosen the frontal assault, committing the 30th Corps and the 10th Corps in a direct push through the Devil's Garden. Rommel's defensive positions, carefully prepared, began taking a horrific toll on advancing British forces. The 88mm guns, despite their limited ammunition, knocked out dozens of tanks. German infantry, dug in and determined, fought with desperate courage. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. For every British tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every infantry company stopped, a fresh battalion arrived. Montgomery had complete intelligence, complete air superiority, and complete confidence. He knew that Rommel's fuel reserves were critically low, that ammunition was rationed, that reinforcements were non-existent. All he had to do was keep pushing, keep attacking, keep grinding forward until the German line broke. Rommel tried to maneuver his panzer reserves, to counterattack at the hinges of the British advance, to use mobility and aggression to offset material disadvantage. But his tanks ran out of fuel within kilometers. Artillery batteries fired their last shells and fell silent. Italian units, subjected to pulverizing bombardment, began surrendering en masse. On the fourth day of the battle, Rommel sent a message to Hitler requesting permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal. It was the only rational option. The line was collapsing. Continuing to fight in place would result in the complete destruction of Panzer Army Africa. A retreat, properly conducted, could save the army to fight another day. Hitler's response arrived the next morning. It was brief and absolute. Victory or death. Hold the line at all costs. There is no alternative. Rommel read the message twice, then crumpled it and threw it on the ground. There is no alternative. Except there was an alternative, and that alternative was saving the lives of 100,000 German and Italian soldiers who were about to be encircled and destroyed, because a madman in Berlin refused to accept reality. Von Mellenthin picked up the crumpled message and read it. His face went pale. "What are your orders, Herr Feldmarschall?" Rommel stared at the tactical map showing British penetrations growing deeper by the hour. He thought about his soldiers, exhausted men who had fought beyond any reasonable expectation, who trusted him to make the right decision. He thought about his oath to the Führer, the promise every German officer made to obey without question. And he thought about his duty to truth, to reality, to the fundamental obligation of a commander to preserve his force. "Prepare withdrawal orders," Rommel said quietly. Codename Operation Atonement. We retreat to Fuca, then to Libya. Inform all units to begin disengagement at nightfall. Destroy nothing we can take with us. Leave nothing Montgomery can use. Move fast, stay organized, and get our people out. The Führer's order, von Mellenthin asked. "Is insane," Rommel finished. "And I will not murder my army to satisfy a dictator's delusions." Issue the orders. The withdrawal began that night. Under cover of darkness, German units disengaged from British forces and began moving west. It was a masterpiece of military discipline, units falling back in sequence, covering each other's retreat, maintaining organization even under devastating pressure. Rommel had drilled his commanders on withdrawal procedures, knowing this moment would come eventually. Now that training saved thousands of lives, Montgomery, reading decrypted German signals that showed the withdrawal order, immediately ordered pursuit. But pursuit was complicated by the very minefields that had protected German positions. British forces had to move cautiously through the Devil's Garden, wary of mines and booby traps. By the time they broke through into open desert, Rommel's rearguard had established new, defensive positions dozens of kilometers to the west. Hitler's response to Rommel's disobedience was predictably furious. Messages arrived demanding Rommel's immediate return to Germany, threatening court-martial, insisting that he resume the attack immediately. Rommel ignored them all. For the first time in his career, he placed the lives of his soldiers above the orders of his supreme commander. It was both liberation and damnation. The retreat continued for weeks, a running battle across Libya. Rommel would establish a defensive position, bloody the pursuing British, then fall back before being encircled. Montgomery followed cautiously, never quite catching the Afrika Korps, never quite closing the trap. The intelligence advantage that had been so devastating at El Alamein was less useful in fluid, mobile warfare where positions changed daily, but Rommel knew the truth. The war in North Africa was lost. El Alamein hadn't been a temporary setback. It had been the decisive battle. Everything that came after was just delay, a prolonged retreat that would end only when the Afrika Korps was pushed completely out of Africa or destroyed, sitting in another command tent. This one near Tobruk. Rommel wrote a letter to his wife. He didn't mention the intelligence failures, the broken codes, the realization that he had been fighting blind for months. Instead, he wrote about exhaustion, about the weight of command, about the growing understanding that Germany was going to lose this war. "I have done everything possible," he wrote, "but sometimes everything is not enough. The enemy has advantages we cannot overcome, resources we cannot match, and knowledge we cannot deny them. I do not regret my decisions, but I fear their consequences." He sealed the letter and gave it to a courier heading back to Germany. Would it reach Lucy? Would it be intercepted by the Gestapo, scrutinized for defeatism, used as evidence in a trial? At this point, Rommel almost didn't care. He had crossed the Rubicon when he disobeyed Hitler's stand-fast order. There was no going back now. In late November, Rommel received a summons to Berlin. He knew what it meant. Hitler would demand an explanation for the retreat, would rage about cowardice and treason, would possibly order his arrest. But Rommel also knew that he was still valuable to the Reich, still famous, still the great desert fox in the eyes of the German public. Hitler couldn't simply execute him without explanation, couldn't discard Germany's most celebrated general without consequence. The meeting in Berlin was surreal. Hitler, surrounded by sycophants and yes-men, listened to Rommel's report with visible impatience. When Rommel finished describing the overwhelming British superiority in men, material and intelligence, Hitler's response was dismissive. "You lost because you lacked faith," Hitler said. "The will to victory is more important than any material consideration. If you had believed, truly believed, you would have prevailed." Rommel stared at the man who controlled Germany's fate and saw nothing but delusion. There was no point arguing, no point explaining that British codebreakers had read every German signal, that American intelligence had been intercepted and used against them, that the entire North African campaign had been compromised from the start. Hitler didn't want to hear truth. He wanted affirmation of his fantasies. "Yes, mein Führer," Rommel said. Because there was nothing else to say. He was given a new assignment, preparing defenses in France against the expected Allied invasion. It was a demotion disguised as a promotion, a way to remove him from active theatre command without the embarrassment of an open dismissal. Rommel accepted it with a mixture of relief and resignation, but the story of El Alamein, of the intelligence war that decided the North African campaign, stayed with him. In quiet moments, preparing the Atlantic Wall, inspecting coastal fortifications, training new divisions, Rommel thought about what Montgomery had said after the battle. The British general had been quoted in the newspapers. Rommel was a great tactical commander, but he didn't understand the bigger picture. It was true, but not in the way Montgomery meant. Rommel understood tactics and operational art. What he hadn't understood until too late was that modern warfare had transcended the battlefield. Victory wasn't just about troop movements and tank battles. It was about intelligence, code breaking, logistics, industrial capacity, and the ability to see the enemy's hand before they played it. The Allies had been playing a different game entirely, one where information was as valuable as ammunition, where knowing the enemy's plans was worth more than any tactical brilliance. Rommel had been fighting World War I with World War II assets. The Allies had been fighting the future. In June 1944, almost 2 years after El Alamein, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. Rommel commanded the defensive forces, but once again he was fighting blind. Allied deception operations had convinced German high command that the real invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Rommel knew better, suspected the truth, but couldn't convince his superiors. Once again, intelligence determined the outcome before the first shot was fired. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied aircraft. He suffered severe head injuries and was evacuated to hospital. 3 days later, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler in the famous July 20th plot. The plot failed, and in the resulting purge, Rommel's name came up. He had known some of the conspirators, had expressed doubts about Hitler's leadership, had disobeyed orders at El Alamein. In October, 2 generals visited Rommel at his home with an offer from Hitler: suicide, with a full state funeral and protection for his family, or a public trial for treason that would end with execution and disgrace. It wasn't really a choice. Rommel took the poison. His death was announced as the result of his injuries from the air attack. Germany mourned its lost hero, the great desert fox, never knowing that he had been murdered by the regime he served.